The coffee at Miller's feed store was always too hot and too strong, but on a January morning in 1971, nobody was complaining about the temperature. 6 farmers sat around the corner table, hands wrapped around white ceramic mugs, talking about the one thing that kept every farmer awake at night: money, or more specifically, the lack of it. "Banks got me by the throat," Ed Carlson said, stirring his coffee for the 3rd time, even though he didn't take sugar. "Bought that new 4430 2 years ago. Payments are killing me. If I don't have a good year, I don't know what I'm going to do." Heads nodded around the table. They all knew the feeling: equipment payments, land payments, input costs climbing every season. It was a treadmill that never stopped. And if you stumbled, if you had one bad year, the bank took everything. "That's farming now," someone said. "Got to spend money to make money." "Got to have the right equipment," another added. "Can't compete with old junk." And that's when Jack Morrison spoke up. "Paid off my land note yesterday," he said quietly. The table went silent. 6 men stopped mid-sip and stared at him. "What?" Ed said. "Paid off my farm, 360 acres, free and clear. Made my last payment to First National yesterday afternoon." Ed Carlson actually laughed. Not a nice laugh. The kind that had an edge to it. "Jack, you've been farming that place for what, 9 years? No way you paid it off already." "I've been at it 15 years and I'm not even halfway done." Jack took a sip of his coffee. 9 years, 2 months. Bought it in December of '61. Another farmer, Pete Sykes, leaned forward. "How much did you put down?" 20%, same as most of you. "And you're telling us you paid off a 360-acre farm in 9 years?" Pete's voice had skepticism written all over it. "I am." Ed shook his head. "That's impossible. Unless you inherited money or had some kind of windfall, there's no way to pay off that much debt that fast on farming income alone. Not in this economy." Jack set his coffee down. "I did it by not spending money I didn't have." "What's that supposed to mean?" "Means I kept my costs low, real low, didn't buy equipment I couldn't afford, didn't expand before I was ready. Just focused on one thing, paying down that principal as fast as I could." Ed laughed again. "You're still running that old Farmall, aren't you? That piece of junk from the 40s? 1948 Farmall M runs fine." "That's exactly my point," Ed said, warming up now, playing to the audience. "You're trying to farm modern acreage with antique equipment. You might have paid off your farm, but I guarantee you're making half what the rest of us are making. You're working twice as hard for half the money." "Maybe," Jack said, "but my farm's paid for, and I sleep pretty good at night." The conversation moved on after that, but the damage was done. Word spread fast in farming communities, and by the end of the week, half of Whitley County knew that Jack Morrison had paid off his farm in 9 years, and the other half was calling him a fool for doing it with equipment that belonged in a museum. Before we go any further, I need you to think about something. If you had to choose right now between having the newest, best equipment and being in debt for 20 years, or having paid off land and running older machinery, which would you choose? Drop a comment and let me know. Because this decision, this exact choice, it's what separates the farmers who make it from the ones who don't. Let me take you back to where this story really starts. December 1961. Jack Morrison was 28 years old, newly married to a woman named Claire, and trying to figure out how to make a life in farming without family land to inherit. His father had been a mechanic, not a farmer, and Jack had learned agriculture the hard way, by working for other men, by saving every penny he made, by watching and learning and planning. When the Henderson farm came up for sale, 360 acres of decent ground about 6 miles outside of Whitley, Jack saw his chance. The asking price was $48,000, a fortune in 1961. He had $9,000 saved up, almost 20%, and First National Bank agreed to finance the rest at 6.25% over 30 years. 30 years, Claire had said when they sat at their kitchen table doing the math. "We'll be 58 years old when this is paid off." "If we make the minimum payments," Jack had said, "but we're not going to make the minimum payments." She'd looked at him. "How are we going to pay extra when we barely have enough for the payments we've got? By not spending money on anything we don't absolutely need." The farm came with a house that needed work, a barn that needed more, and a small equipment shed. No tractor, no implements, nothing to farm with. Most young farmers in Jack's position would have gone right back to the bank, taken out an equipment loan, bought a new tractor and all the implements they'd need to work the ground. It's what the bank expected, it's what the implement dealers encouraged, it's what everyone did. Jack did something different. He bought a 1948 Farmall M from an estate sale for $800. It was red once, though the paint had faded to a dull orange-pink in places. It had a wide front end, a 4-cylinder engine, and about 3,000 hours on the meter. The farmer who'd owned it had died at 83, and his kids just wanted it gone. Jack spent 2 weeks going over every inch of that tractor, changed the oil, cleaned the carburetor, adjusted the valves, replaced the spark plugs and distributor cap, greased every fitting, checked the clutch and brakes and steering. When he was done, it ran smooth and strong. Then he started hitting farm auctions, buying used implements, a 2-bottom plow for $150, a disc harrow for $200, a grain drill for $300, a hay rake for $75. Everything used, everything at least 10 years old, everything cheap. By spring of 1962, Jack had spent less than $2,000 on equipment, and he was ready to farm. His neighbors thought he was crazy. "You can't make money with that junk," they told him. "You'll work yourself to death," they said. "That tractor's older than you are," they laughed. Jack didn't argue with them, just went to work. That first year, Jack planted 200 acres of wheat and 160 of soybeans. He did all his own field work, all his own maintenance, all his own repairs. When something broke, he fixed it. When something wore out, he rebuilt it. The Farmall M pulled the plow, pulled the disc, pulled the drill, pulled the combine he'd rented from a neighbor. It wasn't fast. It wasn't powerful by modern standards, but it was reliable, and it was paid for. In November of 1962, Jack sold his wheat and beans and sat down with Claire to do the accounting. After all expenses, seed, fertilizer, fuel, repairs, land payment, living costs, they'd cleared $6,000. $6,000 that didn't have to go to an equipment payment. "We could buy a lot with $6,000, Claire had said. "We could," Jack agreed, "or we could put it toward the land." They put $5,000 toward the principal on their farm loan. In 1 year, Jack had paid down more of his mortgage than most farmers paid in 5. By 1964, people started asking questions. How was Jack Morrison making it work when other young farmers were struggling? How was he covering his acres with equipment that should have been retired 10 years ago? How was he staying profitable when input costs kept climbing and crop prices kept bouncing around? The answer was simple, even if people didn't want to hear it. Jack had almost no overhead. His equipment was paid for. When it needed work, he did the work himself. When it needed parts, he scrounged salvage yards and estate sales and found what he needed for pennies on the dollar. His fuel costs were lower because the Farmall's smaller engine burned less diesel. His insurance was cheaper because his equipment had no value to insure. Every dollar Jack made from his crops was a dollar he could keep or invest or put toward his land. He wasn't sending $500 a month to John Deere. He wasn't paying interest on a $15,000 equipment loan. He wasn't trapped in the endless cycle of upgrade and replace that kept most farmers in debt. He was free in a way most farmers never experienced, and with that freedom came speed. 1965. Another $4,000 toward the principal. 1966. $3,500 toward the principal. 1967. $5,000 toward the principal. By the time Jack sat down in Miller's feed store in January of 1971 and told those farmers he'd paid off his farm, he'd already sent over $38,000 to First National Bank above and beyond his minimum payments. $38,000 that his neighbors had spent on new tractors and planters and combines. Now, I want you to stop and think about this for a second, because this is the part where most people miss the point. This isn't a story about being cheap. This isn't a story about suffering with bad equipment because you're too stubborn to upgrade. This is a story about understanding the difference between an asset and a liability, about knowing what actually makes you money and what just makes you feel successful. If you're getting value from this story, hit that subscribe button, because we've got more content coming that breaks down the real economics of farming, the decisions that separate the survivors from the ones who lose everything. Ed Carlson didn't believe Jack Morrison's story. Not really. Even after Jack showed him the satisfaction of mortgage, the paid-in-full letter from First National Bank, Ed was convinced there had to be something else, some inheritance, some side income, some trick that Jack wasn't telling people about. So Ed did what a lot of people do when confronted with something that challenges their worldview. He dismissed it. Jack got lucky, Ed told people, had some good years, probably got money from family. Besides, look at what he's farming with. That tractor's a joke. He's working like it's 1950. Other farmers nodded along. It was easier to believe Jack was lying or lucky than to accept that their own decisions might have been wrong, that the shiny new equipment sitting in their machine sheds might be the anchor dragging them under instead of the tool lifting them up. But there were a small handful of younger farmers just starting out, who paid attention, who saw what Jack had done and started asking different questions. One of them was a kid named Daniel Reeves, 24 years old, who'd just inherited 80 acres from his grandfather. Daniel showed up at Jack's farm on a Saturday morning in February of 1971, driving a beat-up pickup and looking nervous. "Mr. Morrison, I'm Daniel Reeves. I was hoping I could talk to you for a few minutes." Jack was in the machine shed working on the Farmall's hydraulics. He climbed down, wiped his hands on a rag. "Call me Jack. What can I do for you?" "I inherited my granddad's farm, 80 acres, and I want to make it work, but I don't have much money. And everyone keeps telling me I need to buy new equipment and expand and get bigger, and I just don't see how I can afford that." Jack smiled. "You can't." Daniel blinked. "What?" "You can't afford it. Not starting out. Maybe not ever, depending on what you want out of farming." "But how do I compete? How do I make money if I don't have good equipment?" "Who told you old equipment isn't good equipment?" Daniel didn't have an answer for that. Jack walked him over to the Farmall M. 23 years old at that point, paint faded, some rust showing through on the hood, but engine idling smooth and steady. "This tractor's older than you are," Jack said, "but it works. Starts every morning. Pulls everything I need it to pull. Doesn't break down much, and when it does, I can fix it with basic tools and parts I can find anywhere." He paused. "More importantly, it's paid for. I don't owe anybody a dime for this machine, which means every dollar it helps me make, I get to keep." Daniel looked at the tractor, at the worn seat and the faded paint and the simple mechanical design. "People make fun of me for wanting to farm small, for not wanting to get big." "Let them," Jack said. "They're farming to impress other farmers. You should farm to build a life. Those are two different things." That conversation changed Daniel's life. He went home, bought a used Ford tractor for $1,200, spent 3 months rebuilding it, and started farming his 80 acres with equipment he could afford. 10 years later, Daniel owned his farm free and clear, and Ed Carlson was filing for bankruptcy. The thing about Jack Morrison's approach was that it worked in bad years and good years. When wheat prices were high, he made money. When they were low, he survived. When drought hit and yields dropped, he wasn't carrying enough debt to bury him. When rain came and crops were strong, he wasn't sending his profits to the bank. He had built a farm that could weather storms. In 1974, when the oil embargo hit and diesel prices tripled, farmers with big new tractors were scrambling to cover their fuel costs. Jack's Farmall, with its smaller engine and simpler design, barely noticed. His fuel bill went up, sure, but not enough to threaten his operation. In 1976, when wheat prices crashed and half the county was underwater on their loans, Jack had a bad year financially, but he didn't lose anything. No payments due, no bank calling. Just a year to get through and plan for the next one. By 1980, Jack was 47 years old. His farm was paid off. His equipment was old, but maintained. He had money in savings. His kids were in college. And Ed Carlson, the man who'd laughed at him in Miller's feed store 9 years earlier, had lost his farm to foreclosure. Let me ask you something, and I really want you to answer this honestly in the comments. Would you rather look successful or be successful? Would you rather have equipment that impresses your neighbors or sleep at night knowing you don't owe anybody anything? Because that's the real question, Jack Morrison answered. And it's the question every farmer, every business owner, every person trying to build something has to answer for themselves. The Farmall M finally gave out in 1983. Not catastrophically. It didn't throw a rod or crack a block. It just got tired. 35 years old at that point, over 8,000 hours on the meter. The engine was worn, the transmission was getting loose, and parts were getting harder to find. Jack could have rebuilt it again. He'd done it twice already. But he sat down with Claire one evening and they talked about it, and they decided it was time. They bought a used International 1086 from an auction, a 1970s model with low hours, well maintained, for $6,500. They paid cash. Jack drove the old Farmall M to the back of his property and parked it under a tree. He wasn't sentimental enough to keep it as a monument, but he wasn't heartless enough to scrap it either. "That tractor bought us our freedom," he told Claire. "Least I can do is let it rest." By the mid-1980s, Jack Morrison had become something of a legend in Whitley County, though not everyone saw it that way. To some farmers, he was proof that you didn't need to get big or go home, that you could make a living, a good living, by farming smart instead of farming large. To others, he was an anomaly, a guy who got lucky with timing and weather and crop prices, someone whose approach worked for him but couldn't be replicated. But to the younger generation, the farmers who were just starting out or trying to survive in an industry that seemed designed to eliminate small operators, Jack was something else. He was hope. Because if Jack Morrison could pay off a farm in 9 years with a tractor older than most of the people reading this story, then maybe the game wasn't rigged. Maybe there was still a way to build something sustainable. Maybe you didn't have to sell your soul to the bank and the equipment dealer and the input suppliers. Maybe you could do it your own way. Jack retired from active farming in 1995 at the age of 62. He leased his land to Daniel Reeves, the young man who'd shown up at his farm 24 years earlier looking for advice. Daniel was running 240 acres by then, all of it paid for, farming with equipment that was efficient but not extravagant. Jack spent his retirement working part-time at the local co-op, helping young farmers with equipment maintenance and repair, teaching them what he'd learned, showing them that a wrench and some knowledge could save you thousands of dollars in mechanic bills. He never got rich, never expanded to thousands of acres, never had the biggest tractor or the newest combine. But he'd done something most farmers never do. He'd built a farm that nobody could take away from him. In 2003, the local Farm Bureau invited Jack to speak at their annual meeting. He wasn't much for public speaking, but Claire convinced him to do it. And on a cold February evening, Jack stood in front of 200 farmers and told his story. He talked about buying that Farmall M for $800, about being laughed at in feed stores and implement dealerships, about making the choice to prioritize ownership over appearance, about paying off his farm while his neighbors were still servicing debt. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then a young farmer in the back row raised his hand. "Mr. Morrison, I've got a question. If you were starting out today, would you do the same thing?" Jack thought about it. "Depends on what you want. If you want to impress people, buy the newest, biggest equipment you can finance. If you want to sleep at night and actually own what you work, buy what you can afford, take care of it, and put everything else toward your land." Another hand went up. "But don't you need modern equipment to compete?" "Compete with who?" Jack asked. "The guy farming 5,000 acres. You're never going to outproduce him, but you can out-survive him, because when prices drop or weather turns bad or the bank gets nervous, the guy with no debt is the guy who makes it through." He paused. "The goal isn't to be the biggest farmer in the county. The goal is to still be farming when the biggest farmer in the county sells out. If you've made it this far in this story, I want you to do something for me. I want you to subscribe to this channel if you haven't already, and I want you to share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's feeling the pressure to spend money they don't have. Someone who's being told they need to get bigger or get out. Someone who needs to know there's another way, because this story isn't just about farming. It's about debt and freedom, and the choices we make about what really matters. Jack Morrison passed away in 2017 at the age of 84. He died in the same farmhouse he'd bought in 1961 on land that had been paid for since 1971, surrounded by family who'd never known what it was like to live under the weight of debt they couldn't escape. At his funeral, Daniel Reeves stood up to speak. "Jack Morrison taught me that there's a difference between farming and running a farming business," Daniel said. "Most people farm. They work the ground, they grow the crops, they do the labor. But Jack ran a business. He understood numbers and cash flow and return on investment. He understood that the goal wasn't to have the best equipment. The goal was to own your land and control your destiny." Daniel paused, looked out at the crowd. Jack paid off his farm 10 times faster than anyone thought possible. Not because he worked harder than everyone else, though he worked plenty hard, but because he refused to confuse spending with investing, refused to confuse looking successful with being successful. After the funeral, they took Jack's ashes out to his farm, to the back 40, where the old Farmall M still sat under that tree, rusted and weathered and forgotten by everyone except the man who'd understood what it really represented. They scattered his ashes there, in the dirt he'd owned free and clear for 46 years. And if you'd been standing there in the evening light, you might have thought you could hear the faint sound of an old tractor engine turning over smooth and steady one more time. The lesson Jack Morrison taught isn't complicated. It's not some secret formula or complex financial strategy. It's simple enough that I can say it in one sentence. You can't build wealth by borrowing money to buy things that lose value. That's it. That's the whole thing. Every dollar you send to a bank in equipment payments is a dollar you're not sending to the bank to pay off your land. Every machine you buy on credit is another chain connecting you to a system designed to keep you working, but never quite owning. Jack understood that. He understood that the path to freedom wasn't through bigger and newer and more. It was through paid off and maintained and sufficient. He understood that the neighbors who laughed at his old Farmall were measuring success by the wrong metrics. They were measuring by appearance and perception and status. He was measuring by ownership and freedom and sustainability. And in the end, only one of those metrics mattered. So let me leave you with this. What are you farming for? Are you farming to impress other farmers? To have the biggest operation in the county? To run the newest equipment? Or are you farming to build something you actually own? Something nobody can take away from you? Something you can pass down to your kids without burying them in debt? because those are different goals, and they require different strategies. Jack Morrison chose ownership, chose freedom, chose sustainability. And while his neighbors were making payments, he was making progress. While they were upgrading equipment, he was paying down principal. While they were impressing people at the coffee shop, he was building equity. And in the end, when the dust settled and the decades passed, Jack Morrison was one of the last ones standing. Not because he had the best equipment, but because he understood what actually mattered. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have had the discipline to farm like Jack Morrison? Could you handle being called a fool for making smart financial decisions? And what's one thing you're spending money on right now that's keeping you from owning what you work? I'll see you in the next one.